Welcome to the Wolf Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. I'm your host Alex. I've sold and bought a few companies and also I've sold billions of litres. Join me on this journey to net zero. Download on Apple Podcasts. Season 1 brought to you by AIM Recruit, the leading recruiters in logistics, transport and energy at www.aimrecruit.com. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolf Power Club podcast. Today we have one of the great institutions that basically looks after the views, opinions and our road quality network. And I guess there's two angles in the energy sector. One, there's the various industries that listen to this podcast that are heavily involved, whether it's our great fans at Storage Terminal magazines, with the likes of Bitumen is brought into this country and used as road layouts, or whether it's our motoring friends and are looking at the power units in terms of the future energy resources and how they're done. The RAC Foundation covers a huge amount of these areas. So today we're delighted to be joined by Steve Gooding, Director of the RAC Foundation. Welcome, Steve.
Nice to be here.
Steve, I think for our listeners, although I have been to many lectures by the RAC Foundations, I'm always fascinated by your opinions and your colleague Neville's opinions on where the world is going and the great work the Foundation does. But can you tell our listeners what the RAC Foundation does and how you ended up as position as a director there?
Well, the RAC Foundation, it's not the breakdown business. We can't fix your car if you have a problem in that front. And it's not actually the members' club on Pall Mall. It was set up by the Royal Automobile Club back in 1991. And it was set up because some really quite far-sighted people in the club at that time formed the view, and I think we hold that view to this day, that there are many benefits that motoring has brought us. But if we don't get real about tackling the downsides, then those benefits are going to ebb away, because the downsides are serious. And the downsides, let's be clear, start with the fact that at the time that the RAC Foundation was set up, the road safety record in this country was not good. We were killing in the region of 11 to 12 people a day on the roads back in 1991. And seriously injuring many multiples more than that. We were also entering a period where we were almost in the foothills, looking back on it now, of understanding some of the environmental challenges that we now recognise we face. In 1991 we didn't have things like the carbon budgets that bind us and the laser-like focus on reductions in CO2. But we did have worries about air quality. We had worries about emissions generally. We knew we needed to improve the way that vehicles operated and the impact they have on the network, the impact they have on society as a whole. So the role of the Foundation, simply put, is to conduct and disseminate research relating to the use of motor vehicles.
Fuel your weekly knowledge with the Wolf Power Club podcast. Subscribe now. One of the reasons I've really liked the RAC Foundation is you've almost taken big headlines or big emotions around these issues and brought fact and information behind some of the most complicated topics that have a huge bearing on our systems. But I'm also interested for our listeners, just before we go a bit more into those big topics at the moment, you guys are investigating the details, about your own career. How have you ended up as this sort of Statue of Liberty, if you described it, peak of looking into the infrastructure? But also one thing I've always enjoyed is your passion for transport, motoring. Every time I go to an event held by you guys, every time you're representing a certain factual part, you bring that across. So how did your career path end up at that stage?
Well, Alex, I think it's fair to say it wasn't a plan, but I spent, as you know, I spent a long time in the transport department. I joined the civil service back in the olden days. I spent over 30 years in and out of what was the Transport Department. At the point I joined, the Transport Department had only just become a separate department after it was merged into the Super Department back in I think what would have been the 1970s. The DFT ceased to exist again while I was there, when it was merged into John Prescott's Super Department, and I did a few spells away on different things. But I spent, as you observe, quite a long time working on transport policy of one form or another over the years. It was 2015 when I jumped ship from the Transport Department, and I wouldn't say that I was desperate to get away at all. It's a fascinating job, and as one of my bosses often observed, the thing about transport is it's probably the only policy area in government that affects everybody's life every day. Whether you're doing the travelling or not, you are affected by the transport system, and it covers everything from the bottom of the ocean to the sky above. So it's a fascinating area to be in. This opportunity came up. I knew the foundation because I'd worked with the guys here before. I knew Stephen Glaister, my predecessor here, well. And it's a pleasure, I think, to do a job that fits with something that one has a degree of professional knowledge about, but also an interest in. And let's face it, I've been interested in cars, motorbikes and the like most of my life, from the point where I had toy cars and motorbikes as a child. So I think bringing those things together into a job where that really is the day job, that's what makes it work for me.
And I'm just interested to ask then, obviously John Prescott was one of the most colourful politicians in British history, and famously got the nickname Two Jacks. But what was he actually like professionally to work with? Because he always seemed a man of huge passion, and I was just interested, what was it like being in that department and around John Prescott?
Well, I think two things I'd say about it, and one is I would agree with you, he was a man of great passion, and he had some very strongly held views and some things he wanted to get done and some things that he was really interested in. I found him perfectly pleasant to work with. I didn't have any trouble with him. Most of the ministers, to be perfectly honest, I struggled to think of a minister I had a problem working with. They were all, I was perhaps very fortunate, but they were all interested. They all wanted to do a good job. I don't think anyone actually comes into politics not wanting to do a good job. They wanted to do a good job. The other thing I would say, though, is one of the downsides to John Prescott getting that super ministry that he had and being Deputy Prime Minister, the biggest problem I had wasn't getting on with him, it was getting access, because he had so much on his plate.
One of the things culturally in Britain is we've always had a sort of annual road tax. It's changed over the years from, a road tax to then suddenly taking in factors of the environment or the value of your car. I know it drives a good friend of mine, Potty, that his 2005 Honda Civic, because it's a Euro 4.5, has a much higher tax bracket than another friend who has a 6-litre V12, but it's a Euro 6. And I was just wondering, therefore, there's other cultures that very much charge per mile or have tolls, and I was just wondering, in this world of EVs where perhaps that car emissions and stuff is moving on a bit, what's your thoughts on charging per mile versus the road tax and some of the research the foundation has done into that?
Again, this is quite a big question you're asking, but let's try and break it down a bit. So let's start with, what are the taxes that we actually pay as of today for using the road network? Well, you're going to pay vehicle excise duty. So my dad, to his dying day, referred to it as the road fund licence, which it ceased to be the road fund back in the 1930s. After a brief dalliance, George Osborne tried to recreate it, but it never quite stuck. So we pay essentially a sum of money for the privilege of having a motor vehicle and being allowed to have it on the road at all. And by and large, that's in the hundreds of pounds. For some bigger vehicles, it's more, but by and large, that's a one-off sum. We can pay, I think, these days in instalments, but it doesn't vary. You pay it whether you do 5 miles a year, 50 miles a year, 5,000 miles a year. You just pay a lump sum. And then we have the duties that we pay on fuel. Fuel duty, obviously, 55 pence on every litre. We pay VAT on fuel. We pay VAT on fuel duty, which I think is one of the smartest. Whoever thought of that in the Treasury, I hope they got a bonus that year, and it probably was paid for out of that. Pay a tax on a duty. Who could make that up? And there are some other bits and pieces. We pay motor insurance tax, for example. Now, the issue looking ahead is that if we're not going to be burning fossil fuel to power our motor vehicles, we are not going to be paying fuel duty as it is currently constituted. There is a question mark about whether there is a successor to fossil fuel to be found. There are people working very hard on synthetic fuel, on hydrogen alternatives.
I guess my one thing, I'd always like the RAC Foundation to consider, because as we progress, you guys undoubtedly will be someone that government and various departments, various civil servants will ask for reports and feedback and knowledge on. But I'd always say the downside of per mile or usage is that I always feel there needs to be some sort of sensible cap on that, because otherwise then it comes a tax for the working. And I appreciate the trucks and the big industry uses the roads in a very high percentage in terms of miles. I mean, my drivers used to do the best part of 250,000 miles a year, not a single driver, but the truck will be triple shifted. And I always was like, though, that there comes a point where it doesn't show necessarily your profitability, because it's a very marginal business, haulage. But yeah, it's a big debate to have and go on with. There's one other duty that I'm interested in your thoughts by, and that is that in vehicles now currently is there prospect of penalties that if you miss the government targets on electric production. So if you're an engine manufacturer or car manufacturer, like a Ford or something, if you don't hit the targets, I think it's 22% this year of selling electric cars, and it goes up to nearly 80% by 2030, that there's a potential penalty of 15,000 per car. I think someone said to me, for a brand new Lamborghini, 15,000's nothing, but as they say, for an equivalent of a Golf or a Ford Focus type car, that's obviously quite a penalty. What are your thoughts about that rules coming into place and that drive to sort of penalise manufacturers for not meeting EV sales?
The government's based its zero emission vehicle mandate on a scheme that's been running in California for a number of years. And again, in principle, the idea of forcing not just incentivizing the purchasers of vehicles to do something, but forcing the sellers, the creators of the vehicles down a particular path. One can see that there's a logic for that if as we've saddled ourselves with a legally binding ceiling on carbon emissions. We've got to get to that. Road use is a significant contributor to our carbon emissions. This is something we need to tackle, clearly. Now, the other thing we might just look at is the number of times that the Californian scheme has been refined, let's put it that way. It's not been scrapped, but it has been changed, it's been looked at again. I suspect we might find ourselves in a similar territory here. But by the same token, I think government being clear with the auto sector, this is what we want from you. Often what I hear from people in that sector, very, very many of whom are engineers, the plea I hear from engineers is, tell me what you want and I'll go and design it. And in this instance, government is saying, I want you to not sell more than this proportion, or continue selling more than this proportion of these fossil fuel burning cars, and I want you to find ways of doing that, and I'm going to put pressure on you to do that. And in a way, I haven't actually heard ministers put it in these words, but in a way that what they're saying is, you're clever people. I have complete confidence that having told you this is what I want, you will now go away and find a way of making it work.
Well, Steve, that leads nicely then. Something this week you chaired was the Dewar breakfast looking at innovation, but you also had one of the, in my opinion, greatest British companies that we can ever talk about, and that's Cosworth. And people have romantic memories of Cosworths in the back of F1 cars. The likes of Michael Schumacher winning his world title with a Cosworth. And this week at the RAC, there was the beautiful new V12 Cosworths, and you said give engineers a problem, they find a way. And I think Aston Martin and Gordon Barry both said to Cosworth, we want a V12, but we want it as small as possible so we can package it in the beautiful hypercars you see that have come out in the last year, the Valkyrie and the T50 Gordon Murray. And it was great seeing those, and we had Cosworth up in the debate talking about the future of the combustion engine. After that debate, and for those who weren't there, basically many different parts of the sector were represented. But I think there was almost a conclusion that there will be parts of the industry that need the combustion engine. So we had one of the best electric bike manufacturers showing where that mobility is going to grow. We had the talks about how EV has come mainstream now over the last decade. But where do you see the future of the combustion engine? You've just come out of chairing that big debate, and we've got some of the best engineers in the world in Britain that have developed the combustion engine. I know myself in the truck world, I still see a long term in the combustion engine. But where do you feel the future of the combustion engine is after the week you've just had?
Well, I think that it's a brave person who puts an actual time limitation on any of these technologies, be it the day when the last one will be brought into use, or indeed the day when something will dramatically change in the ones that we've already got. I think it is, if you look at the trajectory for the take-up of just battery electric cars in this country, you will see that we're heading for the 2030 cut-off in the sale of internal combustion engine only cars, at which point it's still going to be, I think it's something like 2/3 of the cars on the road are going to be internal combustion engine cars. There's something else that should worry all of us when we're thinking about carbon, and that is cars that have met the appropriate standards that were revised by the UNECE in 2004. These cars are lasting longer. So I drive a 2007 car myself. The vehicle is not rusting away. Cars never used to last this long. So I think, point one, we have a lot of internally combustion engined cars on our roads today, and in 10 years' time we're still probably going to have, I'll use the scientific term, a lot still there. So that's point one. Point two, are we going to see further iterations of the combustion engine applied to motor transport on the road? Well, I think if you look at that fabulous Cosworth engine and the Aston Martin Valkyrie, they're fascinating, but they're sort of they're collector's pieces. They're something that they're works of art.
Definitely unicorns. They're
more a work of art than they are a means of transport. Are the auto companies throwing money at future developments of internal combustion engine? No, because we are not the only country in the world that said we're getting out of fossil fuels and you're coming with us. So I don't think we're going to see the hundreds of millions that it takes to develop these engines being thrown at them. What we also heard, you and I, and what others are hearing, is the challenges in other sectors, the challenge in aviation, the challenge in shipping, particularly intercontinental shipping, not necessarily coastal, not necessarily inland, but anything that's got to go a long distance before you can fuel it again needs a lot of fuel. There are ways that fuel can be carried. The issue we have is that fossil fuel is very, very good at carrying energy, and other things aren't nearly as good. So we were hearing that in those worlds it's highly likely that the future for internal combustion will last longer. Now, whether it will last in perpetuity, I doubt.
So a few quick fire questions to end your Wolf Power Club experience. Where would you be investing time in the energy industry? I appreciate the RAC Foundation is not a commercial body, but where would you say is a good place in the year ahead to be investing time in the energy industry?
In the energy industry, well, obviously, I think that our demands of energy are not set to decline. They balance out between different energy consumptions as we get more efficient devices in our homes and hopefully more effective devices. If I were, and I'm looking at this less as an investor, more as a consumer here, I'd be thinking about distribution. I'd be thinking some of the big challenges we've had about making the world an easier place for electric car users has been the problems we have in getting the power to depots for commercial vehicles, getting the power to motorway service areas, which aren't necessarily conveniently placed for the grid as we've got it. And if we think about the grid as we've got it, if we think about getting wind-generated power from offshore across the country and all of the angst that's causing in the east of England at the moment, better forms of energy transmission would be something I think that's crying out for some creative thinking.
Fantastic. Now, a lot of stuff with energy is very long mindset, but I'm just interested in the next 12 months and 2025, what do you want the government to focus on in energy? So just in the next year, what do you want them to sort of try and deliver in 2025?
I honestly don't know whether they can deliver it, but I think one of the substantial industrial strategy issues for this country is the relative cost of energy compared with our competitor countries around the world. And I think that as a matter of international competitivity, if we wish to attract business to this country and inward investment to this country, if in any sense that's based on industrial production, then we need to have a better answer on energy costs.
Brilliant. And then final quick fire question, but after the questions we'll have a quick chance for people to know how they can engage with the RAC Foundation and contact you afterwards. But final quick fire question, what would you like consumers or customers to be doing in the next 12 months? You know, should they be storing away that V8, V12 and getting a wonderful modern, say, family car for the day-to-day? Or what else should the customer maybe be doing in the next 12 months in related to energy?
I'm always reminded, if we wind back, not that many years, before we'll have the anxieties about going electric or not going electric. Question I was asked most often is, should I have a petrol or a diesel car?
Yeah.
And I used to say, well, it depends on what sort of driving you're doing. And this turned out to be really a far more complicated question than I thought I was asking. So what I would say is, if you're someone who drives quite a bit, just give yourself the opportunity to sit down and have a think about what sort of driving you do. What's the circumstance that you find yourself in? Because even as we sit here today, if you did have off-street parking, if you're working in a company that did offer you salary sacrifice, or if you were in the market for a 3-year-old electric car, there are some very good deals to be had out there, and it might just suit you. And think about this. You'd never have to go to a service station again unless you had to buy a bunch of flowers to say sorry to someone.
The RAC Foundation has a fantastic website. You're working on a lot of projects. What's the best way to stay in touch with yourself, Steve? And if our listeners have enjoyed today, how can they engage with the RAC Foundation?
Well, predominantly, Alex, we publish material. We have a website that we try to keep lively and interesting. So have a look on our data pages on our website, where we publish, amongst other things, our Green Fleet Index, looking at the take-up of electric cars, and we try to keep a number of indexes ticking along there so you can see real-time what the world of motoring is actually looking like. That's what I'd encourage people to do.
Fantastic. Steve, I'd really like to thank you for your time today and for the RAC Foundation. It was a great week with London Motor Week. I always loved the Jura breakfast, and I'd say to anyone that by the time the podcast come out, London Motor Week would be in and gone, but in 2025, go along to it, and if you really want to hear a great energy debate, it's one of the most fun areas to go. Thank you very much for your time today, Steve.
You're very welcome.